Hi, good afternoon. This is Bjorn Markeson with IMPLAN. I just want to let you know that we will get started here in about 2 minutes. We're going to give everybody a little bit more time to trickle in, and then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, let's get started. Thank you again, everyone, for showing up this afternoon. Um, Today's webinar topic is showing the impact of research funding. Let me. So I'm Bjorn Markeson. I'm the academic divisional director and economist here at IMPLAN. I'll be guiding you through the webinar today, and we'll be looking at the kind of ways to model and think about, as well as understand, the impacts of changes, and particularly eliminated funding for research. So, we are going to have some time for questions today, and there's kind of two ways to do it. One way will be to enter them into the question box. So if you go over to the right-hand side of your screen in the kind of dashboard for GoToMeeting, there's a little triangle that points to questions. You can click on that and enter your question there. Also, we will have the ability to likely have time at the end for live questions. During the live question period, you can use the raise hand button to answer the question, to ask the question. We'll answer as many questions as we can live. If we don't get to your question live, we will follow up after the webinar. One thing just to note, we have a bit of a broader audience for today's webinar. So in addition to the usual IMPLAN analysts that we have on here, we do have some university administrators and members of the press. So I just want to thank you all for being here. So just to give an overview of today's discussion, with IMPLAN, what we have is a tool that folks can use to navigate complex economic landscapes. And we're going to look at three main topics today. We'll look at the types of impacts that IMPLAN measures. So how do we measure economic impacts using an IO or input-output or SAM methodology? This will be a review for some of you, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what types of impacts we're talking about when we're looking at the economic impacts of decreases to research funding. We're also going to look at the difference between local and national studies. So I'll present some high-level national impact analysis work, and then show some specific approaches using a local example for the North Carolina research region. And then that's going to be the walkthrough part. So we're going to then use IMPLAN directly and demonstrate a walkthrough of this type of analysis in IMPLAN Cloud. So this webinar is going to be a hybrid of showing some of the results we've seen when looking at state and local impacts, as well as walking through an approach to this model, to modeling this type of impact in IMPLAN. All right, so first we're going to kind of talk about what we're talking about when we're estimating the impacts of the research support system using IMPLAN. We talk to folks all the time who are trying to understand the economic impact of their firm, industry, or event. So what do we mean by economic impact analysis? In this case, an economic impact analysis translates the initial or direct impact of a firm or activity into secondary effects that are both indirect, these are from business to business expenditures, and induced, from household expenditures related to that initial event. And the goal of this type of analysis is to get a fuller understanding of the complete employment, labor income, GDP, and tax revenue impacts from that initial event. We can think of this as new research if new research is funded in a community, the employment and output associated with that research is the direct effect. And these are usually pretty evident. A lot of times universities know how much they are spending and how many folks they're employing in that research enterprise directly. The indirect and induced effects are harder to discern, and that is where IMPLAN comes in. It's able to measure those ripple effects, and because those ripple effects are not necessarily obvious, it can be hard to tell what they are at the regional and national level. So when you're using IMPLAN to conduct economic impact analysis, it's important to remember that IMPLAN is based on an input-output or social accounting matrix structure. Our particular model was initially designed by the U.S. Forest Service to estimate the impacts of the forest products industry at both the local and national level, and has been the industry standard for this type of analysis ever since. Over the years, we've expanded that capability and broadened the audience of who can use IMPLAN by making it more intuitive and user-friendly. And it really is the time-tested, easy-to-use input-output based model that allows users to link local events to national impacts. When we're analyzing economic impacts using IMPLAN, it's really important to keep in mind what we're looking at. And in this case, we're looking at upstream effects or backward linkages. And this is particularly important to keep in mind when we're talking about the economic impacts of federally funded research, right? So what we're looking at is a demand side model, and it quantifies backward linkages of production. So from the point of the event or sales, looking at upstream, so in other words, the manufacturer, supply, and resources that go into producing that final good product. And so that's really important, because what we're not looking at is those downstream effects, right? So we're not looking at the impacts of what the research creates. Those are downstream effects. Those are forward linkages, and those are outside the scope of our analysis. And so a lot of times when we're thinking about the economic impacts of research funded by NIH or by NSF or by other entities, we're looking at, a lot of times what we actually see on the surface are those downstream effects, right? So the research leads to scientific advancement, which leads to new products, which leads to so on and so forth. You know, life-saving medications. That's not what we're looking at when we're looking at the economic impacts. What we're looking at is everything that research enterprise spends money on, and what those suppliers spend money on all the way through that supply chain, to really get a better understanding of where those dollars go as they are spent, and what types of jobs and output is associated with that type of spending. Second, what we're looking at is when we look at the impacts of something like capping of indirect costs or federally funded research more generally, what we're doing is we're really mapping the research support system. There are thousands of jobs that are in the supply chain of research activities, as well as fulfilling the needs of those who work in the research sector, and that's what we're looking at today. One thing I want to caution when we're thinking about these effects, you know, we're thinking about a loss of, you know, millions of dollars in research dollars. This is affecting or touching on thousands of jobs across the country. We're not saying that those, you know, this is an on or off switch. What we're really doing is we're mapping those relationships between industries and between consumers to understand everything that is in line with those, you know, that research support structure and that research support system that allows for that research to take place and is affected by changes in those expenditures. So what are we estimating when we're conducting an economic impact analysis on federally funded research? We're trying to estimate all of the upstream jobs, income, and output associated with a given level of output in a particular sector. So we're going to take a look at a shock to the research sector, and we're going to see how that travels upstream. One way to think of this is that there's a broader support system that exists for research even before it's produced. Now, what I'm going to do here is kind of take a first step at looking at some of those regional effects. Much of the analysis that we see using IMPLAN is focused on local impacts. And to some degree, this makes sense because we have the most accurate and usable local economic data and models available. But this type of analysis usually sells short the full impact of the company, the industry, or the event that's taking place. In this case, there are going to be clear local impacts, and they're going to be different for every community that hosts research institutions. We're not going to have time or capacity to dig into all of the different regional nuances as they occur, but I'm sure that all of you are interested in doing that work directly. But the full national effect is important to capture those full effects of capping research funds. So when we're thinking about using IMPLAN for this type of analysis, the first step is to decide the scope of the analysis you're looking for. Where does the event take place? What are the scope of the stakeholders? Who is your target audience? In other words, who are you trying to inform with this study? So a lot of the studies we see are focused on either local, state, or national decision makers, and putting information in front of them so they can better understand the impacts or changes to local economies and national economies from policy changes. So we have data at a variety of different levels to do that. We have the county data is our standard building block of economic impact analysis. Most analysis starts with either a single county or a collection of counties. A lot of times when looking at national impacts and national policy making, folks like to use U.S. congressional districts. So we have the latest U.S. congressional districts structure available in IMPLAN, so you can run those impacts at the congressional district level to better inform decision makers. And so really you want to think about what is that level that you are targeting and trying to inform about the effects of a particular impact. And one of the things that's great about IMPLAN is that it allows you to do all three at once. And that's what I'll show you when I do the live demonstration. What we're looking at is the ability to do local analysis, expand it to a state, a multi-county region within a state, look at the state as a whole, and then expand that to the national impact. So you can see how each of those pieces come together. So what does IMPLAN do? IMPLAN is measuring that total economic impact of a supply chain. And most industries have regional and national supply chains. So when we're thinking about the economic impact, it's important to move beyond just that direct county in which an effect might take place, because the supply chains reach broader. The supply chain reaches beyond just a direct county into a metropolitan region, into the broader state, and then from the state to the rest of the country. The impact of changes to those supply chains can be both broad and deep, affecting a wide variety of regions and industries. So a lot of times specialty products, especially specialty research or medical products, are produced in specific regions throughout the country. Particular areas specialize in production, pharmaceuticals or case in point. And so being able to look at that national effect allows us to have a better understanding of the broad supply chain effects of a particular impact. Okay. So the other thing we want to keep in mind is what are the state local effects of capping indirect costs. And this is really a tricky part of the analysis, right? And we're still working through kind of the different ways of approaching this analysis. For the national impacts, what I've done is I've estimated effects at the state level and then used multi-regional input-output to get to those national impacts. And then for local effects, institutional level estimates were used at the county level and then traced up to the state level. And again, one thing to keep in mind is that, and I'll do this at the for the state level analysis that I'll show you in the software, is that it's important to think about not just the effect of, say, a loss of indirect cost reimbursement, because sometimes there is, as one of the questions that came in mentioned, a tipping point. At some point, the research can't actually be done. And so it's important to look at the overall effect of research expenditures to understand that broader research landscape as well. And we're still trying to figure out, trying to understand what the policy is, let alone the way to model it. It seems like the nature of the policy is changing or becoming, well, not becoming more clear as we go forward. And so doing analysis in this type of changing environment can be a challenge, as I'm sure all of you know. What we did to scope this analysis was we used two sets of data, the key reference point that we started with was an article in the New York Times in the Upshot, looking at how medical research cuts would hit colleges and hospitals in every state. This drew on research and work from James S. Murphy, which is available, and the data are available on his website as well, jamessmurphy.com. And what these were was, two pieces of key information. One, state by state level expected drops in indirect cost reimbursement, and then also institution by institution estimates of both total NIH grant levels and an estimated loss with a 15% cap on indirect costs. So what I'm going to do is I'll walk through a high-level analysis at the national level and then dive into methodology for a state and local level analysis. So again, we're going to take a look at the high-level results here at the national level, and then dive into an example with North Carolina. And so what we did here is we estimated for the national analysis, estimated a cap of 15% on indirect costs for NIH. And then we wanted to look at what the estimated national level impacts are on employment, labor income, GDP, and occupations. Now, as our longtime IMPLAN users know, there's a lot of different ways to cut this data using IMPLAN and looking at the analysis, and we're going to show that with the live demonstration as well. So looking at that national analysis, looking at those main results, what I did was I took the estimated NIH loss from each state, ran that with a R&D industry type as well, we'll get into the methodology with the North Carolina one. But what I really want to focus on here are the indirect and induced effects. High level, if NIH caps indirect costs at 15% through the supply chain on that indirect side, 14,000 jobs in various industries that make up the economic support system of that $5.5 billion industry are going to be affected, right? So looking at this, that indirect effect are business-to-business expenditures that go through that research supply chain and are affecting about 14,000 jobs across the country. That's labor income of a little over $1 billion, almost $2 billion in value add or GDP. Another 15,000 jobs look at are associated with the labor income earned, right? Individuals earn labor income and they spend it. And through those labor expenditures, that drives additional jobs, that drives additional job growth. And so we're looking at another 50, or not necessarily job growth, but jobs that are part of that economic network that supports the individuals through their labor income. So again, another $1 billion in labor income associated with induced effects, about $2 billion in value add. And there's an excellent question that just came in. Given that different types of research generate different impacts, for example, the impact of economic related research may differ from that of natural science research. Curious to understand what kind of data is built into IMPLAN behind the scenes that the model used to estimate impact when I input my research expenditure data. This is a great question. So what I've used here is the research and development support services industry. This is an industry that's built out from the BEA's input-output based data. And what this allows us to do is use a production function that is structured for that particular industry. Now, that being said, you can build out your own production functions, right? You can edit the production functions in IMPLAN. I'll show you how to do that here when we look at the live example in a minute. But what this is looking at is a particular structure of research and development, generally focused on the natural sciences. And so what you can do is we do have a crosswalk table that matches that IMPLAN industry to the federal NAICS codes, so you can dive in and look at what exactly those types of research activities look like. Excellent question. So what I want to do here is I want to dive in and take a look at a couple of other cuts of this data, right? So what are the types of industries that are affected by this outside of the research sector, right? So what I'm looking at here are industries. Oh, yes, excellent question. Question from Tina Reed. Can you clarify the difference between indirect and induced effects? Yes. So indirect, sorry for being a little using the same word for two meanings. We're using the word indirect here in two different contexts. There's indirect costs, which are associated with federal grants. Namely, there's a dollar amount added to the awarded amount that is used for, to put it loosely, overhead expenses, right? So a lot of the institutional infrastructure for that research, right? So it's not necessarily directly, if my understanding is correct, not directly budgeted into the grant application. That's on the federal funding side. That's what's being capped at 15%. In IMPLAN, we have a different definition of what we mean when we mean indirect. Those are indirect effects. And the indirect effect is looking at the business-to-business expenditure and supply chain effects of that research. So in other words, researchers purchase goods, they purchase lab equipment, they purchase supplies, they purchase office supplies, they purchase outside building maintenance contractors. All of these external purchases to the actual enterprise of research are then in that indirect effect, and we follow that supply chain effect. From the researchers buy a laser. So then what is the supply chain of that laser? So it's built from pressed steel and optical lenses. Okay, then where do they get those optical lenses from? Where does the steel come from? And we follow that supply chain all the way back. That's an indirect effect. Induced effects are looking at the impacts from household expenditures. In the model, households earn labor income and they spend some portion of that in the region of interest. And then in this case, we're looking at it at the national scale by state, and those expenditures drive additional impacts. Now, we can kind of see what that difference is here when we look at the industries that are affected, right? So when we're looking at what those impacts look like by industry, we can see that the indirect effects, we're looking at real estate expenditures, employment services, management consulting services, legal services, electronic and precision equipment maintenance and repair, office administrative services, right? So there we're looking at those supplies that are going into that effect. Now, households buy these types of things as well. They also spend money at other food and drinking establishments, right? So we can see that there's a difference between those business-to-business expenditures in the indirect effect and the household-based expenditures in the induced effects. So when we're looking at those secondary effects, this is really affecting a large range of industries. So in other words, it's not just those industries that it's not just researchers that are affected. It's not just universities that are affected. There's going to be impacts on real estate. There's going to be employment on management. There's going to be impacts on legal services. There's going to be impacts on services to buildings, office administration. It's going to be a wide-ranging effect that ripples through that supply chain. And again, what we're looking at here are the national effects of a magnitude that cuts down all of those indirect costs to 15%. It caps them at that. Excellent questions. A question, can the data distinguish different types of institutions? So that's something that the user can use, and what I'll do is when I kind of go into the next piece of this, I'll show you like how you can break that out institution by institution and then filter those results as well. Excellent question. So another piece, surprise that professions such as secretarial services aren't included under the direct effect. So there may be occupations that are affected in the scientific and research development services impact that are directly affected. But what this is saying is that in addition to those occupations, secretarial positions, for example, that are in the direct effect, there's also through that supply chain office administrative services that are impacted beyond that direct effect in the indirect effect. And again, we can look at this in terms of occupations, right? So here what I'm doing is I'm looking at just the occupations that are not in the direct effect. I'm looking at the indirect and induced effect occupations, right? So what are we looking at? We're looking at business operations specialists. We're looking at food and beverage workers. We're looking at moving material workers. We're looking at a full supply chain of occupations that are going to be affected or that are a part of the research infrastructure that are likely going to be impacted in some way by these types of cuts. A question always comes up, where does this occupational data come from? The occupational data are a satellite account to the input-output model that allows us to look at essentially the occupation shifts due to output changes, and we're using data primarily from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to create these estimates. Okay, so now I want to move into the app and show a particular case study. I want to be respectful of folks' time. I think we'll probably wrap up here at around 3:15, but I do want to get into the app and show you some of these pieces. So what I've done here is the first piece is looking at in North Carolina, we're looking at what that NIH cut would look like. So what I've done is I've used the data that was presented in that New York Times piece to build out impacts for individual institutions at the county level, right? So where are we looking at? We're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individual counties within North Carolina that are going to have direct effects. As an analyst, you can expand this or contract this based on the data that you have available. I've also created a rest of North Carolina region so we can measure the effect on the rest of the state of North Carolina outside of these 7 counties. The way I set this up was a little complicated, but essentially what it is I've used for a particular institution, I've used the industry impact analysis detailed option, scientific research and development services as that sector, a negative shock associated with this NIH cut. And then I've zeroed out this middle line, right? I know that there's no proprietor employment or income, no taxes on production or imports, no other property income. So I know what that total output piece is. I can then also look at this in terms of spending pattern. I can edit that spending pattern in terms of what this is, where those dollars go, and I can edit it, right? So I can edit this spending pattern to match the research structure at my particular institution if I have that data. And so again, it can be as customized as you want it to be. I've run each of these in the region of interest as well as a sector for contribution. So we're measuring just the contribution of this activity in these regions. I've run this analysis, and so we can look at what the results are in North Carolina. Good question came in. Can you recommend some tools to learn to improve research methods and analysis? Yes, I would love to. The key place that I would go is my favorite website, support.implan.com. Not, so what this does is this gets you a lot of information, not just on how to use IMPLAN, but how to set up project designs, and it also, very importantly, our references, right? So we're very open book about how we build our data and models. We walk through our data sources and estimation methods, the methodology of how we use IMPLAN. There are also, for subscribers to our software, modules, for training modules that are available as well. And so when we're looking at the impacts in North Carolina, what we're looking at are, overall in the state as a whole, about 1,000 jobs are associated with that cut. In this case, the data from the New York Times suggested that some institutions may have positive and some may have negative effects depending on their current indirect rate. But so that's why I used the negative connotation here. But what we're looking at is, this cut directly, the infrastructure for this in North Carolina is about 1,000 jobs. I can adjust this by region. I can say I just want to look, for example, at Durham County, and I can look at that impact specifically, right? So a large portion of these impacts are going to be in Durham County, 400 jobs in particular in this particular sector. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that there's a broader support piece for this, right? It's not as if these indirect cost rates sit alone and by themselves. They are supporting an overall larger research infrastructure. So what I did to capture that piece is to run a full analysis of those NIH grant expenditures in North Carolina. And I mapped this in a couple of different ways, right? So if I want to look at this just in North Carolina and the counties associated with it, I can do that. Right now, what this is showing me is the full national effect by county, by region, all summed up to that national effect. I can run this and estimate this for just North Carolina, right? So while the cut in the indirect rate may have an effect on, may look like it only has an effect on 1,000 jobs, the overall NIH supported research infrastructure in North Carolina is going to be much larger than that. And that's what we can pull right now and give that specifics here. So we're looking at, 10,000 jobs overall in that research sector. We can look at this, we can cut this by occupation. We can cut this by environmental impact. We can look at the employment piece associated with this. I can say, actually, I want to know what is the effect of North Carolina research on the rest of the United States. A lot of times we think about this type of research as being very local and localized, but the spillover effects of research in North Carolina in the supply chain alone, again, we're not looking at those forward linkages, we're looking at the backward linkages. Those impacts are, that's another 700 jobs across the US that are associated directly with research in North Carolina. And we can think about, what types of industries are affected by that. We're looking at iron mining, forestry, aluminum, right? A lot of the baseline products for that build, scientific research equipment and so on and so forth. We can also look at tax results, right? So if we're looking at tax results associated with this, we can do that. There's dollars that are that flow through these research effects, through the business effects to the state, local, and federal governments. We have estimates for federal revenue, state revenue, county, and then sub-county revenue as well, both special districts, usually that's school districts, but also sub-county general, which are municipal taxes. And really, the difference between that sub-county general and the sub-county special districts depends on where you are in the United States. There's a lot of geographic variation in that. One other thing that I wanted to look at is, I could also look at this in terms of specific institutions, right? So I wanted to look at, since I built these out name by name, I can look at a specific event. I want to know, what is UNC Chapel Hill's economic impact to the state, to the county, to the region, right? So we're looking at 3,000 individuals associated with just NIH funded research at UNC Chapel Hill, direct, indirect, and induced, right? So even when we're thinking about these types of effects, it's important to remember that these aren't just jobs in research themselves, right? Those jobs are there, those are definitely affected, but there's a much broader spread of those impacts to the broader business community, to industries that supply researchers with the goods and services they need, but also the supplier and the supplier all the way through that effect, and that also serve the needs of workers in those industries and supply them with the goods and services they need as well. So I think that's kind of the key piece of what I wanted to show. Again, what types of impacts does IMPLAN measure? The types of those economic impacts that we're measuring with an input-output or social accounting matrix type model are those backward supply chain, or, those upstream effects or the backward linkages of that research activity. And the second piece is to realize that there are, local, state, and national impacts from these types of activities, right? This is not just isolated to, those 7 counties in North Carolina, right? This has a spread and effect throughout the state and even to the US as a whole. And then finally, IMPLAN makes it easy to run this type of analysis, and allows you to kind of use the data and slice it and dice it in different ways to get a better understanding of what's going on in your region with your impacts. With that, I think we can open up some questions. I think we do have it scheduled through 3:30, so we will open for some questions. Michael, do we have any in particular? Or Angela?
Yeah, Bjorn, we have one that just came in. Am I understanding correctly that all impacts on this summary page are the total nationwide impacts, and when you filter for a region at the top, that is just showing the total national impacts associated with the changes in research within the selected region?
Yeah, so let me just kind of step back and pull that here for a second. Essentially what we're doing is we are, by choosing, so let me drop this. If I have no region selected, what it's doing is it's looking at all of these effects together, right? So it's looking at all of the individual counties plus the rest of North Carolina plus the rest of the US. So I can choose to isolate this, right? I can say I'm just interested in Durham and Wake counties, for example, or I'm only interested in Mecklenburg County, or I'm only interested in the rest of North Carolina. So I can run this rest of North Carolina piece, and what I'm looking at here are the impacts of the research that's done in those 7 counties on the rest of North Carolina as a whole. So in this case, what we're looking at is there's no direct effect because the research isn't being conducted in those regions, but there's 400 jobs in the rest of North Carolina associated with NIH type research. And then how's employment service defined in the industry impact output table? How is this output different from the employment number? So employment service, Michael, you might, or Angela, you might be better to answer this for me. We do have a NAICS crosswalk table that would help define that more directly, but I know both of you are very familiar with these types of industries, and maybe you could help out on that.
Yeah, Bjorn, I'd say for James, I'm not exactly sure the question that he is asking here. I'm wondering if
So
he's
I think the
referring to
question is that what is an employment service as opposed to just employment numbers?
So,
Yeah,
okay, that makes sense. Angela.
yeah, I can hop in here. So employment service is one of the 528 industries that we have identified in the current US industry set. So just looking at the bridge that we have available on our support site, it's bridging to certain NAICS codes such as 561, 311. So these are going to be employment services that you contract out from your directly impacted industry. But although they are a separate industry, that's why they're showing up here as an indirect effect to the directly impacted industry. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
It'd be similar to saying like there's a transportation industry, right? It's just some other industry in which they're providing services to the directly impacted one.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
One other thing to keep in mind, and we're talking about these impacts and effects. What we're looking at here is essentially an annual level effect. It takes these are what would be the annual effect for annual decreases in funding in this type of environment. And so we could look at this in terms of not just this year, but kind of an ongoing loss to the economy in one sense. Or another way of thinking about that is that this is the ongoing infrastructure that supports research in the country or in the county or in the state as a whole. Question, how did you pin down NIH type research? This was from the New York Times article, which I can jump back to on the slide. Yes. Yeah, so in the New York Times article, they parsed it out using data and work from James Murphy to isolate those NIH type impacts and then estimated out the effect of the NIH capping those indirect costs at 15%. Excellent question. So for an NIH cap of 15% on F&A, trying to avoid indirect term for confusion, thank you. Are you just modeling the loss as a reduction in the industry detail area? Essentially, yes. So what we're looking at is a decrease in those industry expenditures. Again, this is just from data that we've found that were broadly available. If you're working directly with an institution or a group of institutions, my understanding is that they have access to a broader set of metrics in where they're spending that money. And I believe that in a lot of cases, these are reported through the HERD survey on an annual basis on what those expenditures look like and can be collected at the institutional level. That can be a little more precise, right? So in other words, instead of using these broad scope metrics of how much would be cost, how much would be reduced, looking at those actual metrics on a on an award by award basis, aggregating them up to the institutional level. Can you do sensitivity analysis for scenarios where that NIH overhead percent might be higher or lower? This is a question from Christopher Myers. Yes, absolutely. One of the great things about IMPLAN is that it's fairly easy to run multiple scenarios. In this case, we could adjust these dollar amounts, right? So you can scale this up. You could say 15%, you could do 20%, you could do you know, half of what they currently are, right? So you can adjust those metrics, run multiple analyses, and then kind of give yourself a range of impacts. And that's often a really good way of kind of having a better understanding of what the scope of the impact is kind of by putting a high end and a low end impact and presenting that as a range. Question from Daniel Centario. Question about making the scenario impact more realistic and including wages or employment impacts. Is it possible to see tax results? From where do they come from? Yes. So there are tax results associated with these impacts, and the tax results that we estimate are using the Census of State and Local Governments. So we are estimating those tax effects at the federal, state, and local levels, and we are using that Census of State and Local Governments to do so. The piece about adjusting wage and employment impacts, yes, you can customize that impact, especially in the industry impact analysis detailed structure, to better match the exact data that you have for your institution. So again, the great thing about IMPLAN is that it allows you to customize the data and customize the analysis. And the more data you have, the more you can customize the model and software. Question from Beth: how should we interpret these estimates with respect to uncertainty? I think that the best way to think about this is uncertainty in the original impact, right? So build that uncertainty into the initial impact and give yourself a range of effects. Michael, Angela, do you have a more precise response for this?
Yes, I would absolutely recommend that the user goes to our support site. So the one that Bjorn mentioned earlier, which is support@implan.com. On there, we do have a lot of articles that talks about the basic assumptions that are built into the IO model. So familiarizing yourself with those, understanding that our model is static, all of the limitations that go into this type of modeling will help you get a better idea of how to estimate or predict the effects based on, again, as Bjorn mentioned, your direct effect. So that would be one article. We do have another article on our support site called The Validity of IMPLAN. So it talks about these assumptions that are built into our models and a lot of the processes that we have that go into our quality control of the data and model.
Excellent. I think that's all the questions we have. If we missed your question, we will follow up. We'll have somebody reach out to you. Appreciate your time. Thank you again. If you do have questions or are interested in having a demo of IMPLAN for yourself or your institution, please feel free to contact our sales team at sales.implan.com, and they'll schedule a time to meet that's convenient for you. And again, we also have additional resources. We do have a blog on understanding the implications of the NIH indirect cost cap as well on our website. Excellent. Thank you very much.